The Last Train Before Winter. Welcome to Storyforge, a place where stories come alive. This story is written in clear English, so you can enjoy the atmosphere and practice your listening at the same time. Today, we invite you into The Last Train Before Winter, an autumn journey of hope, memory, and second chances. Close your eyes. Imagine the sound of the train, the falling leaves, and let the words guide you. Chapter 1. The Station at Dusk. The air smelled of leaves and wood smoke. It was late October, and the small town of Ashbourne seemed wrapped in a quiet blanket of gold and gray. The streets were nearly empty, except for the occasional sound of footsteps crunching across fallen leaves. At the far edge of town stood the railway station. It was not a grand station like those in the cities, but a modest brick building with an old clock hanging above its wooden doors. The clock's hands pointed to 6:30, and the fading daylight turned the windows into mirrors of fire and shadow. Thomas Whitaker pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders as he approached the station. He was 58 years old, with a strong build that had softened over the years, and hair that had turned mostly silver. Once he had worked as a firefighter. Years of running into burning houses, saving lives, and carrying heavy burdens had left their marks on him. His back sometimes ached, his knees often complained, but his eyes still carried the steady focus of a man used to facing danger. Now, in retirement, he found his days long and strangely hollow. His wife had passed away 3 years earlier, and his only daughter lived far away in another state. The house felt too quiet, the town too small, and the memories too heavy. Tonight, he was not planning to go anywhere special. He had no urgent reason to travel. But something inside him, restlessness maybe, or longing, had drawn him here, to the station just as the last train of the day was preparing to arrive. The platform was nearly empty. A young couple sat close together on a bench, whispering as they shared a thermos of coffee. An older man in a worn hat leaned on a cane, staring at the tracks as though they held the answer to a secret question. And near the edge of the platform stood a woman with a long scarf wrapped around her neck, her face half hidden by the evening light. Thomas lowered himself onto a wooden bench and waited. The silence of the station was filled with small sounds, the rustling of leaves carried by the wind, the squeak of the old station sign, the distant hum of traffic from the main road. Every few minutes the loudspeaker crackled, announcing the time and the expected arrival of the train. Thomas took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He had always liked autumn evenings. They carried a certain honesty, as if the world no longer tried to hide the passage of time. The trees did not resist the falling of their leaves. The sky did not fight against the early darkness. Everything accepted the change, and in that acceptance there was a kind of peace. Yet, peace was exactly what Thomas could not find inside himself. He reached into his coat pocket and touched the envelope he carried. Inside was a letter, handwritten, folded carefully, sealed, but never sent. He had written it months ago, but he could not bring himself to mail it. The letter was for someone he had not seen in nearly 40 years. Someone he thought he had forgotten, until dreams of the past began returning in the quiet nights. A whistle sounded in the distance. The young couple looked up, smiling. The man in the cane adjusted his hat. The woman in the scarf shifted her weight and glanced down the tracks. The train was coming. Lights appeared first. Two glowing eyes cutting through the dusk. The rumble of steel followed, a low, steady heartbeat growing louder with each passing second. Soon the train emerged from the shadows of the trees, its windows glowing warm against the cold evening light. Thomas stood, his breath visible in the chill air. The train slowed, brakes screeching lightly, until it stopped with a hiss of steam. Doors opened, and a few passengers stepped down. Some looked tired, some cheerful, others lost in their own thoughts. Then came the boarding. The young couple climbed on board, laughing softly. The man in the cane was helped by a conductor. The woman in the scarf remained still for a moment, as if deciding whether to move or not. Finally, she turned, and her eyes met Thomas's across the platform. Something about that look stirred him. It was not recognition, at least not yet, but there was depth in her gaze, like autumn rivers running dark beneath fallen leaves. She seemed both present and far away, grounded yet drifting. Thomas hesitated. He could simply walk home. He could return to his empty house, heat a can of soup, and fall asleep in his chair. Tomorrow would be the same, and the day after, and the day after that. Or he could step onto the train. His hand brushed against the envelope again. He thought of the letter, of the words he had written but never spoken. The train's whistle blew once more, urgent, insistent. The woman in the scarf moved first. She walked toward the open door of the nearest carriage, her scarf trailing behind her like a ribbon of fading sunlight. And Thomas followed. He climbed the metal steps and entered the train. Warmth enveloped him at once. The smell of fabric seats, the faint scent of coffee and oil, the low murmur of voices. Outside, the conductor called, "All aboard!" The doors closed, the whistle blew one last time, and with a gentle lurch, the train began to move. Thomas leaned back, feeling the rhythm of the wheels beneath him. The station slowly drifted away, replaced by dark fields and the faint outlines of trees. The journey had begun. But to where? He did not know. All he knew was that he was leaving something behind, the silence, the emptiness, and heading into the unknown. The woman in the scarf sat 3 rows ahead by the aisle. She turned her head slightly, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met again. Then she looked away. Thomas rested his hand once more on the letter in his pocket. He did not know why he had brought it with him tonight. Perhaps he believed in second chances, even when he pretended he didn't. Perhaps he still hoped for something new before winter came. Outside the window, the last colors of the sunset faded, leaving only the glow of the train cutting through the gathering night. The last train before winter was on its way. Chapter 2. A Stranger with Autumn Eyes. The train settled into its rhythm, wheels clicking against the rails, steady as a heartbeat. Outside the window, fields and woods slid past in shades of black and gray. Occasionally, a farmhouse glowed faintly in the distance, a single light burning against the night. Thomas leaned back in his seat, his hands folded on his lap. He let the sound of the train carry him, half soothing, half unnerving. It was a sound he remembered from childhood, when trains meant adventure and distance, new places and new faces. Back then, he had never wondered about destinations. Everywhere felt wide open, endless. Now, at 58, the train felt different, less about escape, more about searching for something unnamed. The woman with the scarf sat 3 rows ahead, her profile lit softly by the overhead light. Her scarf was long, woolen, a deep shade of red that seemed almost alive in the dim carriage. She sat upright, not slouched, her hands folded neatly over a small leather bag. She wasn't reading, not sleeping, just sitting, eyes on the darkness outside. For a while, Thomas tried not to notice her. He turned his gaze instead to the other passengers. Across the aisle, the young couple laughed quietly, the boy showing the girl something on his phone. Their joy was bright, unself-conscious, like a fire burning strong against the cold night. A few seats behind them, the man with the cane had closed his eyes, his breathing deep and heavy with the exhaustion of travel. A woman with 2 small children hushed them with whispers and soft touches, trying to keep them calm. The train was a small world of strangers, each carrying invisible luggage heavier than the bags at their feet. Thomas reached once more for the envelope in his pocket. He did not pull it out, only touched it, as if making sure it was still there. The letter was a reminder of something unfinished, something that pulled at him like a hidden current beneath still water. He closed his eyes for a moment. The rocking of the train brought back memories. Nights on duty at the firehouse, alarms ringing in the dark, engines roaring through empty streets. The faces of people he had carried out of burning homes, the faces of those he couldn't save. And beyond that, older memories still, ones he had buried deep. A movement ahead caught his eye. The woman in the scarf shifted, standing briefly as if to stretch her legs. She glanced down the aisle, and once again their eyes met. It was not accidental this time. She looked at him as though considering something. Then, slowly, she began walking toward the back of the carriage. Thomas felt a sudden irrational panic. Should he nod, say hello, or remain silent, another nameless traveler passing in the night? When she reached his row, she paused. Her eyes, clear, steady, the color of late autumn leaves just before they fall, rested on him. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice calm, low. "Is this seat taken?" Thomas blinked. The seat beside him was empty. He cleared his throat. "No, please." He gestured to it. She smiled faintly, polite but reserved, and lowered herself onto the seat. The red scarf pooled around her like a ribbon of fading firelight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The train filled the silence with its steady rhythm. Finally, Elena turned slightly toward him. "I hope I'm not intruding. I just prefer not to sit alone on long rides." "Not at all," Thomas replied. His voice came out deeper than he expected. "It's, nice to have company." She gave a small nod. "I'm Elena," she said after a pause. Thomas hesitated, then offered his hand. "Thomas." Her hand was cool, delicate, but steady in his. When she withdrew it, she folded her scarf neatly across her lap. For a while they sat in companionable silence, each looking out the window at the dark world passing by. The faint reflection of their faces floated on the glass, overlapping with the blur of trees. Elena was the first to speak again. "I don't usually travel at night, but tonight felt different. You know how sometimes you just feel pulled somewhere without knowing why?" Thomas felt his throat tighten. He thought of the envelope in his pocket. He thought of the way his empty house had pressed against him until he had no choice but to leave. "Yes," he said quietly, "I know exactly what you mean." She looked at him, studying his face for a moment, then nodded as if satisfied by his answer. "Where are you headed, Thomas?" He almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Honestly, I'm not sure. I just got on." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, surprise flickering across her face. "No destination?" "Not really. Just away, I guess." Elena leaned back in her seat, thoughtful. "That's brave." Thomas gave a small shake of his head. "I don't know if it's brave. Maybe it's just lost." Her eyes softened. She didn't argue, didn't offer false comfort. She only said, "Sometimes being lost is the beginning of finding something else." The words lingered between them, simple but weighted. The train rocked gently. One of the children in the back began to cry, then was soothed again. A conductor passed through the carriage, checking tickets. When he reached them, Thomas admitted he had bought no ticket yet. The conductor raised an eyebrow, but after a short explanation and payment, handed him a slip and moved on. Elena smiled slightly, as if amused by his impulsivity. "You really did just get on," she said. "Yes," Thomas answered, meeting her gaze. "I really did." For a long stretch of track, neither spoke. The quiet was not empty, though. It was full of things unsaid, like a river running deep beneath thin ice. Finally, Elena broke the silence. "Do you know what I like about trains? They feel like in-between places. You're not where you started, but not where you're going either, just suspended. And sometimes that's the only space where it's safe to think." Thomas considered her words. They felt true. He had always lived in places of urgency, alarms, rescues, decisions that had to be made in seconds. He had rarely allowed himself in between spaces. Maybe that's why this journey already felt different. He found himself asking, "So, where are you headed, Elena?" Her answer came slowly, almost cautiously. "Home. Or maybe away from it. I haven't decided yet." He wanted to ask more, but something in her tone told him not to push. Instead, he simply nodded, letting her words rest in the air like falling leaves. The train thundered over a bridge. Below, a river glinted briefly in the moonlight before disappearing into darkness again. Elena's eyes followed it, distant, almost wistful. "Winter is coming fast this year," she said softly. "Yes," Thomas agreed. "It always feels faster the older you get." She turned to him, and for the first time her smile reached her eyes. It was small, gentle, but it carried warmth. Thomas felt something stir inside him, something quiet, cautious, but alive, a sense that perhaps this journey, this chance encounter, meant more than coincidence. The night stretched ahead, long and uncertain, but beside him sat a stranger with autumn eyes, and for the first time in years, Thomas felt he was not entirely alone. Chapter 4. The Long Night Ride. The train pressed on into the depths of night. Outside, the world was little more than shifting shadows. Black fields, bare trees, the occasional glimmer of water under the moon. Inside, the carriage glowed with soft yellow light, a cocoon of warmth and breath in the middle of the vast darkness. Thomas shifted in his seat, stretching his legs. His body felt the familiar stiffness of age, the echoes of years spent running into burning buildings, carrying ladders, holding weight that younger men now shouldered. But tonight, there was also a lighter feeling in him, though he could not name it. Something that came from sitting beside Elena, from speaking aloud words he had kept buried. The train slowed again, this time at a larger town. The station platform was busier. Several passengers climbed aboard, their footsteps echoing on the wooden planks. A group of students with backpacks found seats near the rear, laughing in whispers. A woman carrying a bouquet of flowers sat down carefully, holding the stems as though they were something fragile, almost sacred. Elena adjusted her scarf, turning slightly toward Thomas. She said, "I like watching people board. Every face has a story, though we'll never hear most of them." Thomas nodded. He said, "It makes you wonder where they're going, or what they're leaving." She agreed, saying, "Exactly." Her eyes softened, their autumn shade catching the light. She said, "That's the magic of trains, I think. Strangers cross paths for a few hours, and sometimes that's enough to change something inside us." Elena's words lingered in Thomas's chest. He looked at her and thought how unusual this was, speaking so openly with someone he had just met. But perhaps that's why it felt possible. They had no shared past to protect, no expectations, just this night, this journey. The train pulled away from the station, gathering speed. A low whistle sounded, long and mournful, drifting into the dark. Hours passed, though time felt strange, stretched by the rhythm of wheels on rails. Thomas and Elena spoke now and then, sometimes about small things, the weather, the towns they had passed through, the comfort of tea on cold nights. Other times, silence carried them, not heavy, but gentle, as if the absence of words was its own kind of conversation. At one point, Elena pulled a small book from her bag, its cover worn. She opened it but didn't read, only held it on her lap. Thomas glanced at it and asked, "A favorite?" Her lips curved faintly. "Yes, poetry. I've carried it for years. Some things you don't let go of." Thomas thought of the envelope in his pocket. "I know," he said softly. The train swayed. Beyond the window, the moon hung low, silvering the tops of the bare trees. Inside, warmth wrapped around them, punctuated by the occasional snore, the murmur of voices, the clink of a teacup in the cafe car ahead. Thomas leaned back, his voice quieter now, more reflective. He said, "When I was young, I thought nights like this would be endless, that there would always be another chance, another road. But now, it feels like time is moving faster than I can hold on to." Elena studied him, her scarf pooling against her shoulder. She said, "Maybe that's why we're here, to notice nights like this, to sit still for once and actually feel them." Her words struck him, simple but true. He realized how often he had lived in urgency, alarms, rushing, saving. He had forgotten how to simply sit and notice. The train rattled over a bridge. For a moment, they were suspended above a river, moonlight breaking across the water's surface. Elena leaned closer to the glass, her reflection overlapping with the stars. She whispered, "Beautiful." Thomas looked, not just at the river, but at her. The light caught her profile, softening the lines of grief that lived in her face. He felt something stir in him, something cautious but undeniable. He echoed, "Beautiful," though he wasn't sure if he meant the river anymore. Their eyes met briefly. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. Instead, she rested her hands in her lap, fingers tightening slightly around her book. The night deepened. Passengers shifted in their seats, some asleep, others staring into their own thoughts. The young couple from earlier were still leaning against each other, their breaths slow and even. The man with the cane had woken, rubbing his eyes, before drifting off again. The woman with the flowers had fallen asleep, her bouquet still clutched close, as if she feared losing it even in dreams. Thomas's voice broke the quiet. He said, "Do you ever wonder what you would change if you had the chance to live it all again? Elena looked at him, her gaze steady. She said, "Sometimes, but then I ask myself, if I changed the past, would I still be me now? Would I still be the person who can sit here, on this train, with you?" Her answer surprised him. He had expected regret, longing, but instead she offered perspective, acceptance. Thomas admitted, "I don't know if I could accept all of mine." Her expression softened. She said, "Maybe you don't need to accept everything, just enough to keep moving forward." Silence returned, filled only by the hum of the train. It was past midnight when the conductor walked through, announcing that the next stop would be a longer pause, time for passengers to stretch or visit the station cafe. Thomas glanced at Elena, unsure if she would remain in her seat or disappear into the night. When the train slowed and finally halted, steam hissing outside, Elena stood. She adjusted her scarf and looked down at him. She said, "Would you like to walk for a bit?" Thomas hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yes, I would." They stepped off the train together onto the platform. The night air was cold, sharp enough to make Thomas's breath cloud instantly. The station was small, with an old clock tower and a dim cafe glowing in the corner. A few other passengers stretched their legs, pacing slowly, rubbing their hands for warmth. Elena and Thomas walked side by side down the length of the platform. Their footsteps echoed softly against the wooden boards. Thomas said, "It's strange," looking up at the night sky. "I didn't plan to be here, didn't plan anything at all, and yet—" Elena finished for him, saying, "And yet, here we are." They stopped near the end of the platform, where the lamps grew dimmer and the stars shone brighter. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers, but something closer, like a pause between breaths. Finally, Elena turned to him. She said, "Thomas, sometimes life gives us one more chance. The question is, do we take it or let it pass?" Her words settled deep inside him. He thought of Sarah. He thought of his wife gone these 3 years. He thought of all the days he had spent in silence, waiting for something he couldn't name. He met Elena's autumn-colored eyes. He said, "Maybe this is that chance." For a moment, her gaze held his, unflinching, steady. Then the conductor's whistle blew, calling passengers back aboard. Elena smiled faintly. She said, "Come on, we don't want to miss the ride." Together, they stepped back onto the train. The doors closed, the engine roared, and once again the carriage was moving, forward, into the long night ride. Chapter 5. Confessions Between Stations. The train moved through the night like a patient heartbeat, steady and unhurried, as though it understood the weight of its passengers' thoughts. Outside, the countryside had disappeared into shadows, only the faint silhouettes of trees flashing past the windows, their branches reaching like quiet hands into the dark. The lights inside the carriage glowed with a soft yellow warmth, cocooning everyone in a fragile intimacy. Daniel and Clara sat across from each other, their little table cluttered with 2 paper cups of tea, an empty sandwich wrapper, and a notebook she had been scribbling in. For a long while they didn't speak, listening instead to the rhythm of the wheels against the rails. It was a silence not of strangers, but of people who were slowly learning how to share it. Clara was the first to break it. She leaned back in her seat, exhaled, and said in a low, thoughtful voice, "You know, trains make it easier to talk about things you normally keep buried." Daniel raised his eyebrows slightly. "Because you know the journey will end soon?" "Exactly," she said, a small smile flickering. "It's like a moving confessional. You can spill your secrets to the person across from you, and when the train stops, maybe you'll never see them again. Daniel chuckled softly. That's one way of looking at it. Dangerous, though. What if you do see them again? Then you'll know too much about each other, Clara replied, her eyes glinting in the dim light. The playfulness faded, replaced by something quieter, heavier. She looked down at her notebook, tapping the cover with her fingertips. I haven't told anyone most of what I write in here. Daniel studied her face, noticing the tension in her jaw, the way she hesitated before speaking further. He thought of his own stories, locked away in memory, and how they weighed him down. Maybe this night, in this moving box of light, was a chance to finally set some of it free. Want to trade secrets? He asked. You share one, I'll share one. She tilted her head, considering, then nodded. All right. But you first. Daniel leaned back, eyes tracing the pattern of condensation on the window. When I was younger, maybe 21, I dreamed of being a painter. Not a firefighter, not a practical man, just someone who could take the colors in his head and put them on canvas. I even applied to an art school in Richmond. Got in too. But, Daniel faltered, my father was sick at the time. My mother begged me to stay, to work, to help pay the bills. I told myself I'd go the following year, but 1 year turned into 10, and then it was gone. He smiled faintly, though it was tinged with regret. I still paint sometimes, but not the way I once believed I could. It's a ghost of a dream now. Clara listened without interrupting, her gaze steady. That doesn't sound like a failure to me, she said softly. You gave something up for your family. That takes strength. Or weakness, Daniel countered. Depends on how you look at it. For a moment, the sound of the train filled the silence between them. Then Clara opened her notebook and ran her hand over the first page. My turn. She took a breath, steadying herself. I was married once, 10 years ago. His name was Michael. He was a journalist, always chasing stories bigger than our little life together. I thought I could handle the constant waiting, the late nights, the unpredictability, but one winter he left for an assignment overseas and never came back. Daniel's chest tightened. I'm sorry. Did he? He didn't die, she said quickly. Her lips trembled into a bitter smile. He just didn't return. He sent a letter, said he had found something else, someone else. That was it. She closed the notebook and pressed it against her chest. I told myself I was over it, that I was stronger alone. But every autumn when the days grow short, I remember the winter he left, the silence in our apartment, the way the walls felt too wide without him. Her voice cracked slightly. I write because I don't know what else to do with the emptiness. Daniel leaned forward, his hand almost reaching across the table, but stopping just short. Daniel, he said her name like it was something fragile, something that might break if spoken too loudly. That's not something you just get over, that's something you carry. She nodded, eyes glistening, though she quickly brushed away the tears. Your turn again, she whispered, almost challenging him. Daniel hesitated. His secret was heavier, darker, one he rarely allowed into the open air. But something in her openness gave him courage. 5 years ago, he began slowly, there was a fire, a house on the edge of town. We got everyone out, except one boy, 12 years old. His voice grew thick. I tried. God knows I tried. But the flames, they were faster, stronger. He closed his eyes, reliving it. Not a week goes by that I don't see his face. The words sat between them like a stone dropped in water, ripples spreading silently outward. Clara reached across the table this time, placing her hand gently over his. It was a simple gesture, but it steadied him more than any words could. "Daniel," she said softly, "you can't carry that forever. You're human. You did everything you could." I tell myself that, but the weight doesn't listen. Their hands stayed that way, joined in the dim train light, while the world outside rolled past unseen. It felt less like two strangers sharing stories, and more like two souls recognizing each other in the dark. The conductor's voice interrupted over the intercom, announcing the next station, but neither of them moved. The train slowed, lights from a small town flickering through the windows, then sped up again, leaving the platform behind. As the rhythm of the tracks resumed, Clara whispered, "Maybe that's why we met. Maybe we were meant to share these things before winter." Daniel gave her a tired but genuine smile. "The last train before winter," he echoed, "a confessional on wheels." For the rest of the night they spoke in fragments, about childhood places, half-forgotten songs, the fears that woke them in the night. Their voices were low, their words unpolished, but honest in a way that only late hours and moving trains allow. And when silence finally came again, it was no longer heavy with secrets. It was lighter now, like a pause between verses in a song still being written. Chapter 6. A Choice at Dawn. The train had carried them through the darkest hours, past nameless towns and silent fields, where only the outline of barns and fences stood against the night. Somewhere between stations, Daniel must have drifted into a half-sleep. He woke when the carriage tilted with a gentle turn, and he saw that the sky outside was no longer black, but a deep shade of indigo. Dawn was coming. Clara was still awake, her notebook closed and resting in her lap. She stared out the window as if she were searching for something in the distance. When she noticed Daniel stirring, she smiled faintly, though her eyes looked tired. "Good morning," she whispered. He glanced at his watch. Barely morning. They both laughed softly, their voices hushed so as not to disturb the other passengers dozing nearby. The carriage was quieter now, only the steady hum of the train and the occasional cough or shifting body breaking the stillness. Daniel stretched, rubbing his eyes. Funny how a night can feel longer than a whole week sometimes. Clara nodded. And yet here we are, still moving forward. The words carried a weight he felt in his chest. They weren't just about the train. As the first light seeped across the horizon, fields unfolded like faded watercolors. Mist clung low to the ground, drifting across the rails, as though the earth itself was breathing. Villages appeared in the distance, their rooftops glistening with dew, church spires rising like promises against the pale sky. For Daniel, it stirred something restless. He thought of all the mornings he had watched from firehouse windows, exhausted from a night's work, wondering if life would ever slow enough for him to notice details like these. Now it had slowed, but not in the way he expected. Retirement had given him silence, but also an ache he couldn't quite name. "Where are you going after the train?" Clara asked suddenly, breaking into his thoughts. He hesitated. "Honestly, I don't know. My sister has been asking me to visit her in Roanoke. I told her maybe, but part of me—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Part of me isn't sure if I should just keep moving, find a place I've never been, start over." She studied him carefully. "And will you?" He gave a half-smile. "That's the question, isn't it?" Clara turned her gaze back to the window. The growing light softened her profile, casting her in hues of rose and gold. "I think about choices all the time," she said quietly. "About the life I could have had if Michael had stayed. About whether I should have chased him, begged him to return. But I didn't. I let him go, and sometimes I wonder if that was the first real choice I made for myself." There was strength in her voice, but also a lingering sorrow. Daniel felt a pull to answer honestly. I think sometimes not choosing is its own choice. The trouble is, the older we get, the harder it is to know which path will give us peace. Clara looked at him then, her autumn-colored eyes catching the sunrise. Maybe peace isn't found on the path at all. Maybe it's found in who walks beside you. The words hung between them, unspoken but understood. The train slowed as it entered a larger station. A handful of passengers gathered their things and stepped off, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Daniel watched them from his seat, each one heading into their own lives, their own choices waiting on the other side of the platform. He felt a tug inside, a question pressing harder now. Should he get off here? Should he change the direction of his journey entirely? Or should he stay, see where this train and this woman across from him would lead? When the whistle blew and the train began to move again, Daniel realized he had stayed seated without even deciding. Clara must have noticed his tension because she leaned forward, her hand brushing lightly against his. "Not yet," she said softly. "You don't have to decide yet." The contact lingered just a moment before she pulled away, but it was enough. Enough to tell him that choices weren't always about destinations. Sometimes they were about moments, about staying present when life offered you something unexpected. By the time the sun fully rose, painting the sky in streaks of amber and pale blue, Daniel felt the quiet stirrings of something new. A possibility. Not certainty, not clarity, but the fragile beginning of it. Clara sipped the last of her tea, now lukewarm, and looked at him with a half-smile. "It feels like this train is carrying us to something important." He nodded slowly. "Or carrying us back to ourselves." Outside, the landscape shifted again, the last traces of night dissolving into morning, and as the train pressed forward, Daniel knew that dawn wasn't just arriving outside the window, it was rising inside him too. Chapter 7. The Last Train Before Winter. The train curved through the valley as if it were tracing the line between seasons. Behind it lay the long shadow of night, and ahead the pale light of a new day spilling over fields glazed with frost. The world outside had shifted, autumn's gold giving way to winter's silver. Inside the carriage, passengers stirred awake. Coats were buttoned, scarves tightened, luggage checked. A quiet hum of movement filled the space, the sound of people preparing to step back into their own lives. Daniel sat still, watching his breath fog faintly on the glass. Clara was beside him now, not across the table. At some point during the night, she had moved to the seat next to his, and it felt as though she had always been there. For a long while they said nothing, both lost in thought. But it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of people who had shared too much to ever go back. As the train neared its final stops, Daniel felt a restlessness tighten in his chest. Every mile brought him closer to a decision he wasn't sure he was ready to make. Clara must have sensed it. She turned slightly toward him, her voice low but steady. "This is where the journey becomes real, Daniel. When the train stops, we can't just stay in between anymore." He met her gaze. Her eyes carried the same autumnal warmth he had noticed the night before, but now there was something else, a vulnerability, a question unspoken. "What will you do?" she asked. He let out a slow breath. "I don't know. Part of me wants to just disappear into the next town, start fresh. But another part doesn't want to lose this, whatever this is." Her lips curved into a faint, almost shy smile. "Maybe it's not about losing. Maybe it's about choosing." The word echoed in him. Choosing. All his life he had chosen duty, responsibility, sacrifice. What would it mean now to choose something for himself? The conductor's voice rang out, announcing the last station before the northern routes closed for winter. It was a place neither Daniel nor Clara had planned to disembark, a small town tucked between hills where the river met the tracks. Yet, as the name echoed through the carriage, it felt less like a destination and more like a test. Clara gathered her notebook, holding it close to her chest. She looked out the window, then back at him. "This is my stop." "Yours?" Daniel's heart tightened. She nodded slowly. "I have a cousin here. I told myself I'd visit her before the snow came. I almost talked myself out of it, but here we are." Her hand brushed his as she stood, a fleeting touch that said more than words. "Thank you, Daniel, for listening, for sharing." He rose to his feet as well, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was instinct, maybe fear of watching her walk away. "Clara," his voice faltered, but he pushed on. "What if this isn't just a train conversation? What if it's the beginning of something more?" She searched his face, her eyes shining in the morning light. For a moment, it seemed she might say no, that this was only meant to be a brief crossing of paths. But then, softly, she said, "Then get off with me." The words hit him like a spark in dry leaves, simple, dangerous, irresistible. The train screeched as it slowed into the station, steam rising in clouds, as if the very breath of winter exhaled over the platform. Passengers shuffled toward the doors, boots clattering, voices murmuring. Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears. He looked at Clara, at the way she held herself, uncertain yet hopeful, and he thought of every choice he had delayed, every dream he had set aside. He thought of the boy he couldn't save, of the art he never painted, of the years he let slip like sand through his fingers. And then he thought of Dawn, of the quiet promise of her hand over his in the night, of the way her words had opened a space inside him he thought was closed forever. The doors hissed open. Daniel picked up his bag. For a moment he hesitated, feeling the weight of the decision. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped off the train beside Clara. The platform was crisp with frost, the air sharp but alive. Clara slipped her arm through his as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Together they walked toward the station's exit, their breath rising in twin clouds against the morning light. Behind them, the whistle blew. The train, the last train before winter, rolled forward, carrying others on to their own destinies. But for Daniel and Clara, the journey was no longer about the rails. It was about the steps they were taking now, side by side, into whatever waited beyond the station gates. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt not the weight of endings, but the lightness of beginnings. The last train before winter had brought him here. The rest was up to him. The end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more journeys through English and storytelling. Every story is a chance to learn, and every word is a step forward.